When I entered the courtroom, whispers cut like sandpaper. My daughter Clara and her husband Gavin looked certain of victory, claiming I'd lost my mind and my brother's inheritance. But I saw their greed, their practiced pity. I'd taught law my whole life. Now I'd teach my blood that forgiveness is earned, not owed. If you're watching this video, tell me where you're from or what time it is for you. The air inside that courtroom felt heavier than I remembered. Years of lectures and verdicts had taught me how silence worked. It bent around guilt. It tightened around lies. Clara wouldn't meet my eyes. Her fingers knotted together on the table. Gavin whispered to the lawyer beside him, pretending to be calm, pretending not to notice the way his voice trembled. They thought the old man they dragged into court had already surrendered. They thought the years had softened my spine. But the truth is, time had only taught me how to stand without shaking. I'd spent nights before the trial reading every document, memorizing every false line they'd planted, statements about my confusion, about erratic behavior, about mental decline, lies printed neatly on official letterhead, clean enough to fool anyone who didn't know what survival looked like. I'd seen men lie under oath before. I'd sentenced some myself. I knew the rhythm, the tone, the arrogance that came from believing a lie had finally become truth. When the judge entered, I kept my head bowed slightly, the way a man does when he wants others to mistake humility for frailty. Judge Samuel Holt looked older than I remembered. I'd taught him 30 years ago, back when he still called me Professor Langford, before time put gray in his hair and robes on his shoulders. When he read my name aloud, his eyes flickered. He recognized it instantly, but said nothing. That silence, that single withheld word, was my first victory. The lawyer for my daughter began his opening statement with a practiced voice, heavy on concern, light on fact. He spoke about love, about family, about my supposed decline. He used words like protect, stability, and concern. He tried to turn greed into guardianship. Clara nodded at the right moments, eyes glassy with performance. Gavin squeezed her hand to make sure she cried on cue. When they finished, Nathan, my attorney, the only one who still treated me like a man and not a relic, stood and placed a thin file on the table. "Your Honor," he said, "this is a petition built on fabrication. My client is not only competent, but has demonstrated clarity and precision that most of us envy." He paused and looked at me. He's prepared to speak for himself. The judge nodded. "You may proceed." I rose slowly. Every joint in my body protested, but dignity has a rhythm of its own. "Your Honor," I began, "I am Arthur Langford. I spent 40 years teaching the law. I retired because I believed my students would carry truth further than I ever could. Today, one of them sits where you sit, and another, my daughter, sits where I never thought she would." The room went still. They say I've lost my mind. Perhaps I have lost patience, perhaps tolerance, but not my mind. Nathan placed a single envelope in front of me. Inside was a letter from my late brother, Edward, written weeks before his death, addressed to me in his own shaky handwriting. It wasn't about money. It was about trust. "Arthur," he'd written, "you're the only one who never asked for more than you needed. Promise me you'll protect what matters." I handed the letter to the judge. "This," I said quietly, "is what they are trying to steal. Not cash, not property, the last decent man's faith in me." The opposing lawyer objected. "Relevance, Your Honor." Judge Holt shook his head. Overruled. Nathan then introduced Exhibit B, financial statements showing no unexplained withdrawals, No evidence of neglect, no missing assets. Exhibit C was a video recorded by Dr. Ma Reeves, the physician who'd certified my capacity. Me reciting dates, statutes, my own address, and my consent to every legal action. I watched Clara's expression collapse one muscle at a time. But the turning point came when Nathan played the recording. A familiar voice filled the courtroom. Gavin's. $50,000 should cover it, he'd said to Martha, my former secretary, when he tried to bribe her into testifying against me. His tone was casual, almost polite, as though betrayal were just another business negotiation. When the audio ended, no one breathed. Clara's face went pale. She whispered something to Gavin, but he didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the floor. The judge adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Cole," he said, "do you deny this voice is yours?" Gavin tried to speak, but the sound that came out wasn't a sentence. It was surrender. Judge Holt looked at me again, his face unreadable. "Mr. Langford," he said, "you've been accused of incompetence, but what I've seen here is mastery. Do you have anything more to say before I rule?" I took a breath. "Yes," I said. "Forgiveness is not weakness. It's the last privilege the innocent can afford. I won't press charges against my daughter. She's already lost more than she understands. But him," I pointed gently toward Gavin, "let the law finish what love cannot." The gavel fell softly, like a closing door. The petition was denied. The room erupted in whispers again, but this time they weren't about my frailty. They were about a man who had walked into his own trial and left it standing taller than the accusation. Outside, Clara followed me down the steps, her voice trembling. "Dad, please," she began. I stopped, turned, and saw the same little girl I'd once carried on my shoulders. Her face was wet with tears that finally looked unperformed. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." "You meant for it to start," I said. That was enough. She nodded. "What do I do now?" "Start fixing what you broke," I said. "Begin with yourself." For a long time after that, there was no contact. She filed for divorce quietly. Gavin's case went public. The newspapers called it the Cole incompetency scandal. I didn't read them. I'd had enough of headlines to last a lifetime. Months later, Clara showed up at my house unannounced, wearing the same navy coat she'd worn to court. She looked smaller in it now. "Dad," she said, "I want to help. I want to work with the foundation." I studied her face. There was no act left, no vanity, just exhaustion shaped like repentance. "You'll work hard," I said. "I know. No shortcuts." "I don't deserve any," she whispered. "Good," I said. "Then maybe you're finally qualified." Over the next few months, she became the pulse of the Langford Foundation. She answered phones, filled out grants, mentored applicants twice her age. I watched her learn what restitution felt like. It wasn't loud or fast. It was repetitive, humble, the way a river shapes stone. One evening, after the volunteers had gone home, she sat beside me on the porch. "Do you still hate me?" she asked. "I never did," I said. "I was angry, not cruel. Anger's an honest fuel. It burns what doesn't belong." She nodded, tears catching the last of the sunset. "You forgave me before I asked, didn't you?" "I forgave you the moment you lied," I said. "It was the only way to keep from becoming you." She reached out and took my hand, something she hadn't done in years. The warmth of it startled me. For the first time, The silence between us wasn't heavy. It was healing. The house behind us hummed softly. The furnace clicked. The boards expanded. The scent of cedar drifted through the window. I realized that all the revenge I'd ever needed had already happened. Not through punishment, but through understanding. Gavin lost everything that money could buy. Clara regained what money could never replace. And me? I gained back the one thing I thought age had taken. Peace that doesn't ask permission to exist. Later that night, I wrote the final line in my journal, the same one I'd been keeping since the first day of the case. Justice is not noise, it's architecture. Once you build it right, it stands even after you're gone. Then I closed the book, turned off the lamp, and let the house breathe in the dark. Quiet, steady, warm. The day after the foundation's workshop filled with the hum of saws and steady hands, I began the part no one names out loud, because it doesn't look like revenge, because it refuses theater. It looks like accounting, like calendars, like promises written in ink and honored in silence. I called it the public ledger in my head, though there would be no press release, only a series of choices that shifted weight from where it had sagged to where it could hold. I asked Nathan to draft 3 documents. The first formalized what I had already been practicing: monthly disclosures for the Hearthlight Trust that anyone could read at the library or request by mail. The second created a restitution channel that did not say Clara's name but knew it, a way for her to put in hours that became scholarships, counsel, small grants for people older than the world believed useful. The third named an independent ombudsman, Martha, because accuracy and courage are cousins, who could audit us without asking permission. Revenge needed none of this. Dignity did. Gavin's trial moved, as all trials do, like ice, cold, slow, inevitable. He took a plea on the bribery count after the audio was ruled admissible. His lawyer carved statements into the air about stress and poor judgment. The judge, merciful only where clarity existed, gave him community service and a permanent stain that would outlast whatever tie he chose next. I did not attend. I spent those mornings at the workshop, watching men and women older than failure measure twice, cut once, then sand the edges until the piece fit where the gap had resigned itself to emptiness. Clara was always there before me, keys already turning the lock, hair pulled back, sleeves rolled. She spoke less now, but when she did, her sentences carried weight. She preferred lists over speeches, tasks over apologies. I assigned her the thing that looks easiest and costs the most: calling people who had been told no too many times and saying, calmly, that this time the answer was yes, but show us your plan. She never flinched when the first tears came on the other end, and she never rushed them. That's how you learn to keep heat without burning, by letting relief cool to gratitude before you touch it. The town began to adjust to our new geometry. The newspaper printed updates we did not offer. The mayor posed for a photo we did not schedule. A councilman who had once endorsed Gavin for a chamber post sent a letter about resilience that said nothing and meant less. I answered only what was asked. How many scholarships? Which tools? Where the money went? The rest belonged to silence and work. One evening, the workshop's west window burned with late light while Clara and I reviewed small grants at a folding table that wobbled unless you found its quiet center. A man named Arturo asked for a welding rig to restart a shuttered gate repair shop. A woman named Lenore requested tuition for CAD classes after losing her job at the paper mill. A grandfather named Miles wrote that he could build custom ramps for veterans if he had a planer and a van that started more mornings than it didn't. Clara read each line the way people read prayers when they're not sure who's listening. Slowly, with both hands. Yes to the rig, I said. Conditional on a safety plan. Yes to the classes if she mentors 2 others. Yes to the planer. And tell Miles the van is a separate application we'll help him write. Clara smiled in that tired, honest way new strength arrives. Not as thunder, but as structure. The calls from strangers weren't always kind. Some asked why I hadn't pressed for prison. Some wanted revenge that bled loud enough to stain the walkway. Because blood is a poor building material. I'd say, it doesn't hold. They rarely found poetry in that, so I offered arithmetic. Gavin's conviction meant he could not sit on boards that touched public funds. Every hour he worked off his sentence would go, by court order, to a maintenance program we'd set up with the city to fix neglected rails and loose steps in public buildings. If he wanted to vanish, he would have to do it by making places safer. If he wanted to be seen, he would have to learn to hold weight. I did not ask the judge for that outcome. I did not need to. Nathan drafted a memo. The judge read it. The city signed on because liability understands what morality sometimes resists. The first Saturday, I saw Gavin in a municipal vest. He was on a ladder outside the library, tightening a bracket that had complained for years. He did not see me. Clara did. She walked out with a crate of returns and set it on the cart, nodded once toward him, and then toward me, as if to say that gravity had remembered its job. We did not speak about it at dinner. We did not need to. Forgiveness was no longer a word. It was a schedule. There were setbacks. Always. A donor withdrew a promised check when he realized our disclosures would list his name next to amounts instead of adjectives. A candidate for a scholarship lied on her application about a debt and cried when Martha found it. Clara brought me the file and asked what fairness looked like when someone had been untrue but not malicious. Fairness is letting truth enter the room and then staying long enough to watch it sit down. I said. We called the woman in, listened, set a condition that did not humiliate. She could reapply in a month with a letter from the creditor and a payment plan. We would match what she paid up to a limit if she completed her course. She wept differently then, a sound that wasn't a performance but a release. Mercy with receipts. At the end of each week, I wrote a single page in the black notebook and tore it out for Nathan's files. Numbers, names, outcomes, no adjectives. Behind those pages, I kept the private ledger I never showed. A list of small reversals that cost no one a headline and bought everyone a habitable night. Evan's wrist no longer flinched. Sophie spoke without looking for permission in adult faces. Rachel laughed once at the wrong moment and then covered her mouth like she'd committed a trespass, and I told her she hadn't. That laughter was a form of repair. At the workshop, Arturo hung the sign above his bays with letters straighter than the men who once told him he was too late. Lenore sent a thank you sketch of a part she had modeled and milled. Miles drove up in a van we helped him secure with a clause that required the first 3 ramps to be free for those who needed them most. I began to sleep deeply again, not because the past had softened, but because the future had somewhere accurate to land. Revenge, if that word still applied, had become indistinguishable from maintenance. Once, near dusk, as I locked the workshop, Gavin approached the gate and stopped like a man who knows he has earned only distance. I finished the courthouse rails, he said. They no longer rattle. I nodded. Good. Rattling scares people who are steady and lies to people who aren't. He swallowed, a boy again inside a man's shame. Will you ever, he began, and I spared him the noun. I don't hate you, I said. Hate is a hobby for people who don't build. He stood there long enough to hear the meaning. Thank you for the chance to work, he said. You weren't given a chance, I answered. You were given a task. Keep completing it. He didn't argue. You can't argue with a bridge. In late autumn, I asked Nathan to add one final mechanism to the ledger, an annual evening called Open Quiet, when anyone could walk through the workshop without tours, without speeches, with nothing to sell and nothing to beg, and see only what walls and hands had learned together. We placed the ledgers on a table, a pot of coffee nearby, and let people read the year as if reading the rings inside a felled tree. Clara stood near the back, her posture neither defensive nor performative, the stance of a person who understands that the work is the explanation. Rachel arrived late with the kids. Evan brought a model bridge he'd built from scrap hardwood, the joints tight, the spans true. Sophie carried a poem about light that doesn't know it's light until it touches wood. They pinned the poem on a corkboard beside the first flyer we had ever printed, and I felt something inside me stop bracing. After the last visitor left, we swept the sawdust lines the way farmers rake hay, careful, rhythmic, grateful for the proof of harvest. Clara switched off the bandsaw, turned, and for the first time since the courtroom asked her to define me with a petition. She said, "Dad, I'm proud of you." I waited for the old anger to clang against the compliment. It did not. Age had taught me that praise is just another form of responsibility. "Be proud of the room," I said. It held us. On the walk home, the air smelled like rain making up its mind. The house glowed as it always had when the thermostat guessed right, and the porch light threw its square of gold across the steps. I placed the week's ledger on the table, poured tea, and wrote a line I had been saving for the day revenge no longer needed a definition. I did not turn pain back upon its authors. I turned it forward into structure. In the morning, I mailed copies of the disclosures to the library and slipped an extra into the slot addressed to the judge, not because he asked, but because men who carry gavels deserve evidence that balance exists outside their chambers. In the afternoon, I sat with Arthur's last student, the one who mattered now, who shared my name and did not know yet how to carry it, Evan, leaning over a workbench while he learned that sandpaper is patient and wood answers only to consistency. "How do you know when it's smooth enough?" he asked. "When the light stops catching on it," I said, "and only rests." He nodded. His hands understood first. That night, sleep came before I reached for it. In the half-moment between waking and gone, I saw Edward's handwriting again, protect what matters, and understood at last that he had never meant money. He meant the conditions under which people can stand and not shudder. That is the only reversal that sticks. Everything else is theater. The house exhaled, the furnace clicked, and the ledger waited for new ink, not as a record of victory, but as a recipe for warmth. Winter didn't arrive as an event. It seeped through seams, thin and precise, reminding the house that warmth is a verb, not a guarantee. By December, the workshop smelled of metal and pine, a blend that always made me think of balance, creation with resistance. Clara had settled into her rhythm. She no longer asked if she was doing enough. She simply did. The volunteers followed her lead, showing up early, leaving late, learning that purpose doesn't clock out. Every month we sent out new grants, quiet ripples of correction. I kept the ledgers tight, every receipt annotated, every cent accountable. Revenge was long over. What remained was structure. Yet some nights, when the heater clicked and the world fell still, I could feel the echo of anger moving inside me like a pulse that refused extinction. It wasn't hatred. It was memory reminding me what had been stolen, and what I'd chosen not to destroy and return. Gavin's restitution work continued under city supervision. I saw him sometimes at dusk, repainting the railing outside the courthouse, the same steps where my sanity had once been debated. He looked different now, smaller but steadier, a man learning the weight of consequences. One evening, as I passed by on my way to deliver the foundation's winter donations, he turned, paint on his hands, eyes unguarded. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said. "I didn't expect to either," I replied. We stood a moment in the cold, watching the light fade over the courthouse dome. "You know," he said softly, "I thought punishment would break me. Turns out, it just removed the excuses." I nodded. "That's what truth does. It strips, not shatters." He looked like he wanted to say more, but the foreman called, and he returned to his work. I walked away, lighter than I expected. In January, the foundation expanded into legal assistance for retired workers. Clara handled most of the interviews, but she insisted I meet one applicant, a man named Peter who'd been defrauded by his own son. The case was a mirror held too close. I listened to his story without flinching, without offering the easy comfort of cliches. "What will you do?" I asked. He shrugged. "I'll forgive him when it stops feeling like surrender." I smiled faintly. "Then start forgiving yourself first. That's where the structure begins." When he left, Clara lingered by the door. "It still hurts to hear their stories, doesn't it?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "But it hurts right. That's the difference." She nodded and went back to her desk. There are kinds of pain that become scaffolding if you let them. By early spring, the foundation had more applicants than hands. Nathan advised we hire more staff. Dr. Reeves suggested automation. I preferred slowness, speed breaks meaning. We chose instead to train new volunteers, men and women who had once been recipients themselves. They brought stories instead of resumes, and that turned out to be the better credential. The world began to notice, reluctantly at first, then with curiosity. Reporters wrote about the Langford method, a phrase I never used, because what they called method was just patience. When the first journalist came for an interview, I told her to talk to Clara instead. "She's the architect now," I said. The article ran with her photograph, and for the first time, the headlines carried her name untainted. I saved the clipping without nostalgia, just accuracy. One evening in March, she asked if I ever regretted not pressing charges against her. I looked up from the ledger. "Regret is for things you didn't build," I said. "I built you back." She didn't cry. She just reached over and touched my wrist, the same way Margaret used to when words had done their job. Later that month, the foundation hosted its first community dinner. No speeches, no donors, just people sharing tables. Rachel came, quieter than I'd ever seen her, serving stew, cleaning plates, her laughter returning in small doses. Gavin wasn't there. His probation still restricted travel, but his absence no longer carried bitterness. It was just a vacancy time would fill or forget. Evan and Sophie ran between tables, carrying trays too heavy for their size, and when they spilled, no one scolded them. Accidents were proof of effort. Near the end of the night, Clara stood beside me, eyes glistening under the soft string lights. "You've turned revenge into a language people can live inside," she said. "I didn't," I said. "I just stopped letting anger be the architect." Outside, the snow started again, thin flakes drifting like punctuation marks that refused to end the sentence. I stepped out to the porch later, after everyone had gone, and looked across the street at the courthouse. The lights inside were still on, a janitor's silhouette moving across the glass. Justice never sleeps, people say. I think it just cleans up after the mess we make of it. The wind carried the faint sound of laughter from the workshop across town. For once, I didn't analyze it. I just let it be what it was, evidence that correction could hum like music. I went back inside, turned off the lamp, and stood by the fireplace. The embers glowed, red, quiet, honest. The house no longer needed guarding. It had become what I'd wanted all along. Not a fortress, not a museum, but a system that held warmth the way law should hold truth. Evenly, humbly, without ceremony. Spring crept into Portland with the precision of an old craftsman, replacing frost with drizzle, ice with soil, silence with the measured hum of renewal. The workshop windows fogged each morning from the heat inside, from people and purpose working in tandem. I woke earlier now, not from duty but from habit. Age doesn't demand alarms. It just reminds you there's less time to waste. Clara had taken over the logistics entirely. Her desk was always covered in grant applications, notes written in her neat, careful hand, and the inevitable cup of coffee gone cold before she ever reached the bottom. Watching her work was like watching someone rebuild their own bones. Slow, exact, painful, necessary. I didn't interfere much anymore. The foundation had its own rhythm now, its own breath. Every Friday, I walked the perimeter of the building, checking for loose boards, dripping pipes, things that time wanted to reclaim. Maintenance, I'd come to realize, was love disguised as discipline. Most people only fix what's visible. I preferred to fortify what wasn't. One afternoon, after a storm that made the river rise to the lip of its banks, I found Gavin standing near the edge of the property. He wasn't supposed to be there. Technically, his probation restricted contact. But there he was, cap pulled low, jacket worn thin, the look of someone who'd rehearsed this moment too long to back away. I didn't speak first. He did. "They said the foundation's expanding," he said quietly. "That you're adding a mentorship program for ex-offenders." I nodded. "We are." He hesitated, the kind of pause that used to come before a lie, only now it carried weight instead of manipulation. "I'd like to apply," he said. "Not for forgiveness, for usefulness." I studied him for a long time. His eyes were clear, sober, tired in the right way. "Applications are online," I said. He smiled faintly. "I don't own a computer anymore." "Then come Tuesday," I said. "Martha will help you fill it out." He nodded, thanked me once, and left without waiting for more. That was enough. There are few things rarer than a man who finally understands the size of his mistakes. Later that week, Clara mentioned the program during a board meeting. "It could work," she said. "If we set strict parameters, if we trust that people can change under structure." I met her eyes across the table. "Structure's all they ever needed," I said. "The lack of it was the crime." When the vote passed unanimously, I didn't smile, but something inside me loosened. The first session took place on a Thursday morning. 8 men, 2 women, all of them carrying their histories like weight you couldn't see but could hear in the way they breathed. Gavin sat in the back, quiet, attentive. Clara opened with rules. I closed with silence. Sometimes leadership is just not interrupting. Weeks passed. The mentorship grew. The newspapers stopped calling it the Redemption Project after I sent them a letter asking for precision. "It's not redemption," I wrote. "It's calibration. Redemption suggests you were once pure. Most of us never were." That letter went viral for reasons I didn't understand. People crave honesty until it demands adjustment. By summer, donations tripled. I hired 2 new coordinators, both former recipients. The work became self-sustaining, a closed loop of giving and correction. And in that steady rhythm, I found a peace I hadn't thought possible. It didn't erase the past. It integrated it, like a repaired joint that remains visible but stronger. Clara often said I looked lighter. I told her it was the light doing better math. She laughed, that quiet, almost shy laugh she'd inherited from Margaret. One evening, after locking up the workshop, she stopped beside me, eyes on the horizon. "You know," she said, "I used to think forgiveness was an ending. Now I think it's just good design." I turned to her, smiling. "It is. Every structure that stands long enough learns how to flex." She nodded, understanding more than the words, and we walked back to the car in silence. That night, I dreamed of Edward for the first time in years. He wasn't speaking. He was sitting at his drafting table, drawing the bridge we'd designed together as boys, the one we'd never built. When I woke, the dream clung to me like dust. I went to the workshop before dawn, unlocked the door, and spread a sheet of paper. I redrew that bridge from memory, the lines trembling but true. The next day, I showed it to Clara. "Let's build this," I said. "Not for travel, just for learning. A structure that begins and ends in the same place. For the kids, for the lesson." She smiled through tears. "A bridge that goes nowhere." "Exactly," I said, "but it holds." Construction began that spring, a project small enough to finish but meaningful enough to matter. Evan led the design team, Sophie painted the signage, and even Gavin came on weekends to sand planks and hold beams steady. When it was done, the bridge stood over a shallow pond behind the workshop, illuminated by soft lights at dusk. It led from one patch of grass to another, no grand destination, just a walk, a pause, a reflection. At the opening, Clara placed a plaque at its entrance. It read, "For those who built again after breaking." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I stood at the center of the bridge. The boards beneath my feet creaked, not in warning, but in gratitude. I thought of Edward, of Margaret, of the courtroom that had once tried to measure my worth in affidavits and signatures. None of that mattered now. Justice had already done its quiet work. Forgiveness had done the rest. I looked across the pond, at my daughter, my grandson, and the man who had once betrayed me holding the final bolt for Sophie to tighten. The circle wasn't perfect, but it was whole. That was enough. The bridge became a landmark, not in any official sense, but in the quiet way people remember something that steadies them. By midsummer, locals began calling it the Reflection Walk. Every afternoon, someone new crossed it. An old carpenter with a limp, a child with scraped knees, a widow who left flowers at the rail, then stood there as if waiting for the water to answer back. It wasn't about where it led, it was about how it held. The structure didn't hum or sway, it simply existed with patience, like a truth that no longer needed witnesses. Sometimes I stood there at dawn, when mist still curled around the lights, and listened to the faint rhythm of the water beneath. It sounded like breath, slow and deliberate. Clara said the place had started to change the town, though she didn't know how to explain it. "See, people come here and leave quieter," she said once, "like they've been measured and found balanced." I told her it was the wood doing its work. Cedar doesn't rush, it teaches. She smiled and said maybe I'd finally built something that couldn't be argued with. I wasn't sure. The world always finds new arguments. In August, the foundation hosted a summer workshop for the scholarship students. They came from different states, different failures, but all shared that familiar mix of doubt and determination. I walked through the rows of benches as they worked, offering advice when needed, silence when not. A young woman asked if I believed people could truly change. Change isn't the point. I said. Adaptation is. Bridges don't become rivers. They just learn to stand over them. She nodded like she understood, though I knew understanding would come later, after mistakes. That's how it always works. By September, Clara convinced me to let others handle most of the operations. You've earned rest, she said, though the word rest has never meant much to someone who measures days by movement. Still, I agreed, and found myself with hours I didn't know how to fill. I started walking the town again. The streets that had once whispered my name during the trial now greeted me with nods. I'd stop at the cafe on the corner, the one that used to serve me in silence, and Martha would slide over a cup without asking for payment. Foundation discount, she'd say. I paid anyway. Fairness isn't about saving money, it's about paying what balance costs. One morning, as I sat by the window, I saw Gavin crossing the street with Evan. They carried a box of tools, laughing about something I couldn't hear. It struck me then, not as pride, but as relief, that my anger had finally gone somewhere useful. I left the cafe before they noticed me and walked toward the pier. The sea air was sharp, briny, alive. For years, I'd avoided this view because it reminded me of endings. Now it felt like a continuation I hadn't earned, but was still invited to witness. I stood there until the horizon blurred into the color Margaret used to call the mercy between days. That evening, Clara joined me at the bridge. The sun bled orange across the pond, and the air smelled of cedar and wet earth. She carried 2 cups of tea, handed me one, and leaned against the railing. You know, she said, people think this bridge was your redemption. I shook my head. It's theirs. I just provided the lumber. She laughed quietly, then said, Do you think Mom would have forgiven me? She already did, I said. She just sent me to finish the paperwork. We stood there in silence, listening to the frogs beginning their nightly recital. For once, silence didn't feel earned or forced. It was just there, honest, present, without agenda. Later that night, as I walked home, the lights from the bridge reflected faintly off the windows of the workshop. Inside, tools hung neatly on the walls, every one of them in its place, everyone cleaned and ready. Order is a fragile thing, but for now, it held. I poured myself a drink, sat at the table, and opened the black notebook one last time. The pages were nearly gone, the edges frayed, the ink faded where my hand had lingered too long. I read the first line I'd ever written. Silence is not absence. It is a controlled environment. I traced over the words with my finger, steady now, and added a final sentence beneath it. Forgiveness is not the end of the story. It's the architecture that lets it stand. I closed the notebook and left it on the table beside Margaret's photograph. The next morning, the light came early and clean through the windows. Outside, the world kept working, saws humming, voices rising, the small commerce of ordinary grace continuing without my direction. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to measure it. The house, the bridge, the foundation. They all existed without me pulling their strings. That was the truest proof of balance. When the design no longer needs its architect. I stepped outside, the porch warm under my feet, the air smelling faintly of rain and sawdust. Down the hill, I could see Clara unlocking the workshop door, Evan beside her carrying his sketchbook, and Gavin already setting up the tables. The sound of their laughter carried up through the morning mist, a sound that didn't belong to repair anymore but to life resuming. I stood there until it faded, then went back inside, poured another cup of coffee, and let the quiet finish its work. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.